This is the penultimate full-length episode of the second season of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and what a season it has been. If you like what you've heard, please consider supporting the show over at patreon.com/EPSpodcast and epspodcast.substack.com, or by sharing, liking, reviewing, and following the show on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram, and wherever you get your podcasts. The Oregon Trail. That term evokes images of either pioneers making their way from east to west in the middle of the 19th century, or their computer game where, no matter what you do, at least one of your characters will die of dysentery. The game was such a staple of elementary school computer labs throughout the 1980s, and many of us who played it on the Apple IIe probably assumed that Oregon Trail just fell into the mix of Where in the World is Carmen San Diego and Number Munchers as games developed all at the same time with the purpose of entertaining and educating our generation. But the Oregon Trail has its origins earlier than with the personal computer revolution, making it, and those who created it, pioneers in their own right. Dan R. Morris, host of the fantastic history podcast Tracing the Path, joined me recently to talk about the educational game and from where and when it came. So choose names of your travel companions, load up the wagon, and try to avoid contracting medieval diseases. We're about to embark on the Oregon Trail. I'd like to welcome you back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm Eric Paul, and I'm being joined today by this is a special guest and we'll explain just how unique our meeting is. But I'm being joined today by Dan R. Morris, who is the host of the Tracing the Path podcast, and it is so I'll tell you, Dan, I last week I started listening to your show. We got in touch with each other, and I started listening to your show, and my wife actually said, because I was putting it on as we were driving around, and then we put a podcast on almost every night when we go to sleep. And she's like, don't put that one on again when I'm trying to sleep, because I stayed awake listening to it the whole time. I didn't want to miss anything. She's like, put on the ones that I can just kind of, phase out. So it's such an interesting show. Where did you come up with the idea for the Tracing the Path podcast?
So that is an excellent question and a fantastic segue, because when I was a teenager, maybe even early college, I used to listen to Paul Harvey. And like your wife, Paul Harvey was the only thing. I don't care how late I was to a meeting. If Paul Harvey was on the radio, I was not turning the car off until it was over. So I wanted to create that for my kids, like some sort of a story where it's not YouTube, it's not visual, it's in their brain, the pictures, all that stuff that makes them not want to end it. Like, let's keep the car on, Dad. Let's drive around the block one more time till it's over. Like that concept. And so that's how it came to be, really.
It's awesome, and I love the idea that. Just like Paul Harvey used to do, when you would hear, the beginning of his story, you would not guess the end at all. Like there would be no way that you would make that leap. You're like, oh, he's talking about, this is easy. He's talking about Benjamin Franklin. It's like, no, he did such a wonderful job, the theater of the mind, being able to paint a picture for you and walk you through something that, it was a limited time, because usually it was like the morning was when he would tell you the first part, and then the afternoon you'd hear the second part, the rest of the story, and you would get the rest. And it was like, you actually, in that short period of time, you came to care about that story, even if you didn't think, that you would. And so in the afternoon, you're like, and imagine how different it would be if he had a podcast, if he was still alive, because I don't think it would have that same magic to it of being able to, just pick it up anytime. It was part of like the routine, of the day, because I still do it now. I don't know if you do this. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and sometimes I catch myself doing the Paul Harvey thing where I'm sitting in my car. I'm like, I don't want to turn this off right now. Oh, wait, I can, because it'll be right back on where I leave. But like, I'm just so trained to like, not turn the radio off, because I'll miss it. But that's why I think the length of your program is really nice, because it allows for you to, say, all right, which, where is he navigating us through right now? Which direction are we going to go? So it's awesome.
Paul Harvey had this quote before he retired. He was speaking, forgetting an award, and he was talking about the power of audio. And I remember him saying that when he was a kid and he was listening to the stories on the radio, is that he always felt like the hero of the story looked a little bit like him. And I always thought, wow, that is amazing. Just like every kid is listening to a story about a hero, and every kid, like, you put a little of yourself into the story. And so I was telling that to someone online, and somehow my love of that quote made it to Paul Harvey Jr., who actually wrote me a letter, because he then started listening to the podcast, and he wanted to start a podcast, which he did. He started a little one, but he got a little busy. But I think I might actually be helping him start another podcast.
That would be, and for you, that talk about your own like full circle kind of thing, being able to,
because Paul Harvey Jr. actually wrote all of the rest of the stories for his father. So he has it. Cool. He has the technique. It's not like he's just happens to share the same name. He shares some of the same interests and talent. Then he just doesn't say, "And now for the rest of the story."
He doesn't, because only his dad could do that. I remember Mike Huckabee. Exactly. Mike Huckabee tried to take over for a little while.
That was,
and it just wasn't quite the same. I'm like, you gotta,
sad.
Get your same. You can't do it, So don't try to replicate. So we could go on all day about our love of radio, because I think that's what brought us both right here. Is that I'm so happy to live in a time period where making my own radio show is possible. And it's like, and I, don't like to use a lot of the video component of it, because to me, I've had people come up to me. I do a live thing sometimes. I do it's called podcast karaoke, where I have just random stuff on my table, and people come up to me and they choose something from my table, pop culture thing, and then they sit down, we talk. And,
nice.
I get some really cool stories out of people. It's a lot of fun happens in those. But there's been times where people who are just like, oh, are you on YouTube? Do you have videos of yourself? Do you, and I'm like, I don't know. It seems kind of like to defeat the purpose of an audio medium. Like, I don't like to watch radio necessarily. I mean, it's like, I think the exception would be maybe when Howard Stern would be on Entertainment, because there is a lot of visual stuff on his show that it supplements it. You could enjoy the show in the morning, but it supplemented his stuff. But I think overall, that's kind of the purpose of podcasts and radio, is it's all listening. You don't need to see somebody.
Definitely a purist when it comes to podcasts. I believe it's an audio program, and if you add video, then it's a YouTube video. It's not a podcast anymore; it's a video.
Yeah.
So. I don't understand the video podcast concept. Like,
it is odd.
The same thing as a talk show,
right?
What's the difference?
It's just call it that. Like right now we are using video just because it's easier to talk, through this futuristic thing, which by the way that like camera phones just kind of arrived, like I'm like, if I could go back in time to like as recent as like maybe 2001 and tell myself, hey, we're going to be talking to people through the computer as if it's, the Jetsons. It's like, right, like they're right next door, because that's always like the science fiction futuristic version that we do this, but it just seemed to happen so quickly. I'm like, oh, wow. We're doing this, and it's no thing, it's not like we're talking on the phone right now.
Well, your show is about primary sources. So here's a concept for you. When I lived in Dover, which is where you live, you're near now.
Yeah.
I have this very distinct memory of looking at my phone, which at the time was hanging on the wall in the kitchen. And for some reason, and I believe it was because we were teenagers, but we had one of those cords that was so long, I could be in my room and be on the phone, and other people had to like walk under the cord as they went through the kitchen. But I remember thinking at the time that video phone was coming. But because of the world that we lived in, I looked at my phone and I thought, someday there's going to be a video camera on this. And I thought to myself, does that mean that everyone is going to have to like clean their kitchens all the time?
Yeah.
Because I didn't have the foresight that the phone wouldn't someday be on the wall.
Right.
I only had the foresight that maybe video would be added to it, and then it would always be right there hanging on the wall in the kitchen. And I just thought, who's going to want to do that? Your dirty dishes would always be in the background. So I thought, it's never going to make it.
But you can only envision what you have.
Yeah.
You know, it's only what's available then. It's really difficult for humans to perceive things or conceive things that there's no basis for. You know,
so
because
that's a good segue for today's show, because the people that we're going to talk about actually had vision.
Right.
And could see things that we could not see.
And they use that vision to help us see into the past so well. So
yes, and into the future, as it happens to be.
Incredible. So perfect. So today we are talking about the Oregon Trail, and not the actual trail itself, but rather the computer game. And
the computer game.
I have some incredible memories playing that game. I can still see the black screen with the green, images and the prompts and everything. And my favorite part was usually naming my family. So I would usually name them. I would, crack up because I'd name them after, as it turns out, pop culture figures. So I'd be like Wayne and Garth and Oprah was in my family. It was like all these, early
That's
90s references and stuff. Cause that's when I was, fourth or fifth grade, and they brought us to the computer lab. Every school had a computer lab, and they'd have you boot up the disk with, the floppy disk with Oregon Trail on it and get it going. And, at that time, I didn't really understand the actual, timeline of the real Oregon Trail, like when it was really first, the pioneers heading out on it and everything. It wasn't until, got a little bit older and found out, the chronology of things, that it's not related to, I think when most people think about pioneers, they sometimes wrongly assume it's like post-Civil War, but we're talking about pre-Civil War, early Trailblazers, hence the Portland team, in Oregon, the basketball team who went out there. But today we're talking about the game. And so
Indeed.
The way things work on this podcast is I go through an artifact analysis form. We treat things like even video games, computer games, like you would find museum artifacts being treated, behind glass and interpreted to tell us something about the time period which they came. I shared that document with you. We oftentimes go in order from material it's made out of all the way down to prescriptive versus descriptive. But is there a spot on that form that you think would be a great place to start the story of Oregon Trail?
Well, I do think it probably needs to start maybe even the setup of how it came to be.
Yeah.
Before we go into it, for those people who may or may not know of it, or maybe you only know the modern version of the Oregon Trail and you don't really know the beginning of the Oregon Trail. It was 1963 when this story ultimately starts. And at the time, Minneapolis, Minnesota was kind of like the Silicon Valley of the United States. A lot of the big companies were in Minnesota, and that is because Minnesota was largely a mining and a mill town. So Pillsbury and the cereal companies, were all in that area. The rivers, the iron ore from above, all the foresting, all that stuff, and the farming made Minnesota this great place for these big companies to be. And we're talking about big companies like IBM and GE and Univac, like Sperry and Rand and Medtronic and Honeywell and Central Data Corps. These are like big
Yeah.
companies that are all computer-based. And what happens when all of the big computer-focused companies are in the same town is that the people who work there end up being on the school board. They end up running your local Cub Scouts. They end up being married to the teachers who live there. Like, so the Minnesota environment was largely computer forward. Like, they just happened to be in a time and place where computers being a part of the business became something that parents were interested in.
Yeah.
And a guy named Dale Friends, who was a teacher, he said, I think kids need computers in the classrooms. We're talking about 1963. He's basically saying, I mean, this is before Apple exists. Like, this is cutting edge thought.
Because in those days, the computer was about the size of a classroom. So,
yeah,
it wasn't personal computers by any means.
So, fortunately, because all of the people on the school board, all of the people in the district, all of the teachers were somehow related to some big computer company, he actually was in an environment that was supportive of this concept. Like, this sounds like a good thing. We should do this. And GE provided them a $5,000 grant. Pillsbury provided a server. So like the community, the environment of the time, and I think a lot of historical things that happen, even Bill Gates' situation, how he creates Microsoft, ends up a lot to do with the environment they're in.
Absolutely.
So Dale Friends is in this environment where everyone is for it, and the school board actually says, you know what, let's create a group to help you do this, which ended up being called TIES, TIES, which was a Total Information for Education Systems. And they said, okay, Dale, get computers in the classrooms. What does that take? And that's when he went out and got a grant, and the money was to cover not only getting computers, but in order to create a network, they needed to be a server where all of the computers could plug into, and it used to be more like a hub and spoke model, where all the computers called into one server, and then that server held all the information. Well, the only place he could find a server was in Dartmouth, New Hampshire, where you are. So at Dartmouth gave him rights to use the server, which meant all of these Minneapolis schools, their computers had to dial in to Dartmouth, which at the time was a long-distance phone call.
Yeah.
So that's what the $5,000 was for, was to pay for the long-distance charges and for the computers in order to make this network work. And so because computers were a part of the community, coding was a big part of the local colleges. It was part of continuing teacher education. It was just like coding computers was kind of part of the fabric of Minneapolis culture.
Yeah.
So many of the teachers took some coding classes, and for Dale Friends' network, they actually wrote little programs, like a little math program that a kid could go to the back of the classroom if he needed extra help and do this math program while the teacher was teaching the rest of the kids. So all of a sudden, you've got an environment where the school board is saying, put all kinds of computers in the classrooms. The teachers are saying, ooh, this is fun. We can make little things to make our lives easier.
Right.
And we can just make little programs. And then the local college, Carleton College in Minneapolis, 3 students there, Bill Heineman, Don Rawich, and Paul Dillenberger, they had to do, Don Rawich had to do some sort of a program for his class to teach about westward expansion.
Mm-hmm.
So he came up with, I'll do a game based on the Oregon Trail. And his idea was the students will take out a map and they'll have to draw the Oregon Trail on a map. And then he was going to give them checkpoints that they had to find, like cities they had to find on the map.
Mm-hmm.
You could see how this would be like an educational concept.
Yeah.
And then he was going to ask them trivia questions to go from one checkpoint on the map to the next in order to get across the Oregon Trail. you could see how this would sound like a teacher-oriented kind of a game. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to have them draw the trail, and they'll answer some questions and see if they can make it to the beginning to the end. Well, his roommates, Paul Dillenberger and Bill Heineman, they said, this would be a great game for the computer. This would be a good computer application. And at the time, the only computers they had were teletype machines that didn't have a monitor. So there's no monitor.
Yeah.
There's only typing, and then it prints out a little answer.
Sounds great.
So Don Rawitch said, there's no chance that we can make this in 8 days. But in 8 days, they made the Oregon Trail. The three of them programmed this game for the teletype. And they programmed it so well that no one would ever play the same game twice.
Okay.
Because the questions that were asked, the teletype machine would take the answer and spit out the next question. But the way they designed it was the teletype machine would take into consideration how much money they had, how long it took you to answer the question, where you were on the trail, your health, like all of these things in order to spit out the next question. So every single person that would play it would take a different amount of time to answer the question, would answer a different way, would go a different direction. So there ended up being like 79,000 different ways you could play the Oregon Trail from beginning to end. So 1972 comes around, and the Vietnam War begins, and there's a draft, and Don Rawitch is drafted. And he says, well, I am a, what is that called? Conscientious objector. I would rather serve my community in a different way. So the government says, well, if you are going to do that, you have to find a program that will last 2 years where you volunteer to do something for the community. That's how you're going to get out of the draft. So this is, let's just say this is in the Choose Your Own Adventure books. This is option A.
Right.
So option A is Don Rawitch is going to find something else to do. Well, Dale of Friends, who had been running the TIES program for the city of Minneapolis, helping get computers into the classroom, he did so well that the state of Minnesota said, you know what, Dale of Friends, would you be interested in doing that for the entire state? Would you be interested in helping us get computers in every classroom in the state? And if so, we'd like to create a new program we're going to call MEC, the Minnesota Education Consulting Consortium. And if you are a fan of the Oregon Trail, you will know that every time you ever played the Oregon Trail, the MEC logo would come up before the Oregon Trail game.
I can see it, yeah.
So Dale of Friends became head of MEC, and their job was to get computers into every classroom. And at that time, Don Rawitch was being asked to go find something to do that would benefit society, basically, instead of going into Vietnam. He, through his contacts at Carleton College, found out about MEC, and he ended up becoming an intern at MEC for Dale of Friends. So now we have a connection where the guy who actually wrote a computer game called the Oregon Trail is now paired up with another guy who insisted that every kid should have access to a computer in the classroom. This is kind of where the story begins, where those two people meet. And so Don Rawitch is an intern. He's doing whatever he's supposed to do. This is a few years after he created the Oregon Trail game for the Minneapolis. They ended up loading it up to the Minneapolis school system, the network, through Carleton College. And some kids played it, and they enjoyed it. And he remembered getting feedback. And here he is at MEC. And he's seeing what Dale of Friends has done, and he's seeing all these computer programs that the teachers have made, how to do math, how to do science, like all of these things. And he says, would you guys be interested in another piece of software? And they said, yeah, we can use whatever you can get.
Yeah.
So over Thanksgiving in 1972, he retyped the entire Oregon Trail game from a printout that he'd made several years earlier into MEC's computer consortium. Like the entire thing in 3 days, what took them 8 days to write. And that's when Oregon Trail relatively became famous in Minnesota. That's when every classroom had the opportunity to take it. And they were still working on getting more and more classrooms computers, but the ones that had access now had access to the Oregon Trail.
Wow.
Now, not every school in Minnesota had access because of money. And the money problem was the long-distance phone calls. Like all of these schools had to dial into a remote server.
Were they still calling all the way to Dartmouth College?
Dartmouth.
Or they were still doing that? Okay.
Yeah. And this is where Pillsbury steps in. Pillsbury says, we happen to have a GE server. We're in Minneapolis. We'd be happy to help solve that problem for you. But complications come with any time you're dialing into a system. So while that was a great option and they switched to the Pillsbury server, it wasn't the final option. They really needed to figure out a way to do this better. And so in 1977, in Cupertino, California, there was a computer show called the West Coast Computing Fair. Now, there weren't that many computer shows in the United States. So this one, if somebody was interested in computers, this is the one to send people to. So the state of Minnesota sent some of their representatives from MEC to the West Coast Computing Fair to figure out, like, what are our other options?
Huh.
And one of the booths at the fair had this little personal computer that had a disk drive. And the disk drive was something they'd never had before. And not only did it have a disk drive, it had a remote disk drive that could be plugged into the computer, unplugged, and plugged into another computer. So they thought, we could take all of our software, we could put it on a disk, we could take it to one computer, load it on the computer, take it out, drive to the next school, load it on the computer, drive to the next school. They could easily get all of the software everywhere. Well, this computer company in Cupertino, California, at this West Coast Computer Fair, was only 2 guys. And the main guy's name was Steve Jobs.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah. This was Apple. This was Apple's first foray into trying to sell their computers. This is their first show. They were at the West Coast Computing Fair. Steve Jobs had this unbelievable idea, the same that Dale Friends had, that everyone needed computers.
Yeah.
But Steve Jobs had one problem. He didn't know how to tell people why they needed it. He knew they needed it. He knew it was the future.
Yeah.
He knew it would make life better. But he didn't know how to explain to people that they would need it. But when the MEC people showed up at his booth and said, this is our problem.
Mm-hmm.
We have all this software. We've got math games. We've got all these things for people to do on a computer. But we don't have enough computers. And we don't have a way to do it cheaply so that we can avoid paying the long-distance costs.
Yeah.
For Steve Jobs, that was the watershed moment. Like, holy mackerel.
Yeah.
Now I know why people need computers. So MEC and Apple sort of teamed up. Apple bought a license, like became a licensed reseller of MEC software. And MEC bought 500 computers from Apple to put in all of their classrooms. So at this point in time, in 1978, Apple had only sold 7,600 computers. But after this moment, 1 year later, they have sold 57,000 computers.
That'll do it, yeah.
Because once the Minneapolis school systems and all of the Minnesota school systems started using this software, other school systems around the country started hearing about what they were doing, and they wanted to be part. Without the Oregon Trail, without this game, without this software and all these other little math games, then it wouldn't have been as attractive because the students were interested. Because, when Oregon Trail game was put on a computer, kids would line up down the hall after school to play on the computer to play the game. Like it was popular. And teachers would tell other teachers, you would not believe that our students, how much they're learning about westward expansion through this game, and they're dying to play it. Like they just want to play it.
Yeah.
Like that concept made other schools want it, made other teachers want it, made other school systems want it. And for the first time in Apple's history, it made the world want an Apple computer.
That is such an incredible, connection. And because the story of Apple computers has been told several times, but they oftentimes leave that component out. That Steve Jobs mentality of, I have something that you're going to need, but you don't know you need it yet, seemed to be the thread all through the rest of his life, leading into the 21st century with the iPhone and, iPod and all the, before it and everything of I have something that you are going to find to be necessary for your life. You just don't know it yet.
Yes.
And, but this little, actually very big detail of using it for educational purposes, I think is so critically important because it reminds me of the way television was first introduced to people. And it wasn't as quite of a big leap because movies had already existed. So people understood the idea of watching a screen and getting entertainment from that screen. But when television started, putting a smaller screen into people's homes, the television programmers had a bit of a dilemma. They're like, should we, they had pressure from, different groups and, educators in particular, schools and different institutions of this device should be used primarily for education, not for entertainment. Of course, we know that entertainment won the TV battle, that it's used primarily
Indeed.
For education. We do get, or entertainment, we do get education in the form of news. And then there's educational programming in some of the channels. And of course, PBS. And it seems like, if I'm not mistaken, PBS has its rise to prominence in the same era, this late 60s, early 70s period, where now computers are showing up and that same dilemma is presenting for them. Here's this computer, let's get it, because obviously people do more with computers now than just learning on it. It's not just for schools. We compute with them and we do lots of other things, but it seems like that is such a reflection of the era, the priorities of the time period, that you have tech people saying, we have this device, we have things you can do with it, but our first stop is the schools. Our first stop isn't even, because Office has already had computers to, but as far as the PC, the actual, our first stop is the kids. Let's get the kids on these things and learning like they can't learn in other places. This program not only treats items that aren't usually considered to be documents of the past as artifacts, on par with those behind glass at museums, but it also celebrates what can be done with primary sources. In order to teach children about the settlers of the 1840s in an authentic way, the creators of the Oregon Trail needed to turn to the primary sources of those people. Diaries, letters, and other documents from the mid-19th century fed the creation, therefore, of the teaching tool about it in the mid-20th century. The Oregon Trail game was just what the pioneers and risk-takers of the early personal computer revolution needed to create their world, paralleling the actual Oregon Trail that was blazed by people who risked losing the comforts of the East to try to create a home in the Pacific Northwest. To listen to the second half of my discussion with Dan R. Morris from Tracing the Path podcast about the Oregon Trail, head on over to patreon.com or Substack to have access about 3 months before the rest of the world. But first, it was mentioned earlier in this episode that Dan and I had our own Tracing the Path moment. Well, here's the rest of the story on that. Just to complete the story that I said before, real quick, when we were talking, getting, texting back and forth, listeners, what we did was we found out that, and I found out through listening to one of your episodes that not only had you lived around the same area, the seacoast of New Hampshire that I live in and grew up in, but I teach at the school that Dan went to school in. So, well,
Yeah,
in the short, I'm like, talk about tracing the path. That's like the perfect, I'm like, but then I think about the computers and the algorithms. I'm like, maybe the AI had a little bit of, putting us together. Maybe it brought my thing to you because it knew that you had that connection. But anyway,
I know, I'm just excited to share the episode with my alumni group.
That's cool. Yeah, we're going to definitely have to do that. And so, Dan, thank you very much for joining the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. And thanks for everybody for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything, including Oregon Trail, not the trail, but the game, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time.